Hello, everyone. Welcome to Lawrence Technological University's online symposium, Plague Literature in the Time of Coronavirus, an online symposium for the quarantined. Tonight is the second session, the title of which is Sheltering in Place Like an Expert, and tonight's discussion is devoted to Boccaccio's book, The Decameron. We're very glad that you are here. I want to recall the moment in the film Casablanca when Elsa and Rick and Sam are in the cafe at night before the Germans march in. The cafe is La Belle Aurore. And they're drinking as much of the fine wine as they can possibly drink before the Germans capture it. And Sam says, this should take the sting out of occupation. Well, the symposium, along with my glass of wine, should take the sting out of quarantine. And I recommend you have a glass of your own. Now, I want to thank some people who were crucial in putting this together. Dr. Lynn Miller-Watisha, who's the Director of E-Learning Services. Christian Forrest, who is the Director of Web Services. Julia Lampus made our beautiful flyer. Mary Cody gave technical assistance. And Scott Lehman, who is in the media production coordinator for e-learning services, gave crucial help, and he's also present. There's Scott. So Scott will be present tonight, but not on the screen. Let me remind you that you in the audience are welcome to submit questions. You should do that with the question and answer Q&A button on your screen. The questions you write go to Scott. If you are interested in speaking, then raise your hand, and Scott will let me know. And so you're welcome to join the conversation tonight, either with a short text message, which I will read, or by joining the conversation audibly. I'm Dr. Phil Vogt. I'm an associate professor of history in the Department of Humanities, Social Science, and Communication. I have really interesting co-panelists tonight. Professor Serge Danielson-Francois, who's an adjunct instructor at Lawrence Tech in literature and composition, is on the panel, and Dr. Valerio Capozzo, who is an associate professor of Italian in the Department of Modern Languages at the University of Mississippi. And Dr. Capozzo is also the secretary of the American Boccaccio Association. So this should be very interesting. Before we start the discussion of Boccaccio, let me remind you that a week from tonight, the third session of the symposium deals with the diary written by Samuel Pepys and the Journal of the Plague Year by Daniel Defoe. Okay, so Dr. Danielson-Francois, who's going to give us an overview of the Black Death of the early 14th century and Boccaccio's great work, The Decameron. Dr. Danielson-Francois?
In 1348, the Black Death comes to Florence, and it's been working its way from the east over to Europe. It started in China about 1333. When it makes its way to a city like Florence, it's an unsettling event, it's a disorienting event, it's a disruptive event. And Boccaccio decides to take as his inspiration that mood and that time, and he creates a cast of characters, a brigata. And in that brigata are 7 young women who happen to be meeting at a religious site, Santa Maria Novella, and they are joined by 3 young men who aren't there for any religious purposes. They're really there to be with the young women. They decide that good medicine for them would be talking about anything but the plague. In a sense, we're doing something similar in turning to literature in this time of COVID-19. And they come up with some rules. One of those rules is that each member will be king or queen for the day, and that they can set the tone or the theme for the tales that will be told. There are 10 of them, and they tell 10 tales each day. They are together for 2 weeks, but they take a break on a Friday and a Saturday, and then they go down to a valley at one point where the young women are able to bathe. The tale that I'm going to tell is from the 5th day, when Fiammetta is the queen, and she's asked for a story about love in the midst of grief and suffering. And the tale I'm going to tell is the tale of Nastagio. It's the 8th tale that is told on that day. In Ravenna, the most ancient city of Romagna, there were of old many nobles and gentlemen, among whom was a young woman named Nastagio degli Onesti, who became exceedingly rich on the death of his father and uncle. As happens to young men without a wife, he fell in love with the daughter of Messer Paolo Traversaro, a girl of far more noble birth than he, whom he hoped to win by his actions. But however fair and praiseworthy they were, they not only failed to please her, but actually seemed to displease her. So cruelly, harshly, and unfriendly did the girl behave, perhaps on account of her rare beauty, perhaps because her lofty and disdainful nobility of birth made her despise him and everything he liked. This was so hard for Nastagio to bear that for very grief, he often desired to slay himself. But dreading to do this, he very often determined to leave her, or if he could, to hate her as she hated him. But in vain, for it seemed that the less hope he had, the more his love grew. As the man continued to love and to spend money recklessly, his friends and relatives felt that he was wasting both wealth and himself. So they often advised and begged him to leave Ravenna and to go and live somewhere else for a time, to diminish his love and his expense. Nastagio several times made mock of this advice, but unable to say no to their repeated solicitations, he agreed to do it. He made great preparations as if he were going to France or Spain or some other far-off land, mounted his horse, and left Ravenna accompanied by many of his friends. He went to a place about 3 miles from Ravenna called Chiasi, and having set up tents and pavilions there, told his friends he meant to stay there and that they should return to Ravenna. There, Nastagio led the most extravagant life, inviting different parties of people to dine or sup, as he had been accustomed to do. Now, in very fine weather, about the beginning of May, he began to think of his cruel lady and ordered his attendants to leave him alone so that he could dream of her at his ease. And in his reverie, his footsteps led him into the pine woods. The 5th hour of the day was already spent, and he was a good half-mile inside the woods, forgetful of food and everything else, when suddenly he thought he heard a loud lamentation and the wild shrieks of a woman. Breaking off his sweet reverie, he raised his head to see what it was, and to his surprise found himself in the pine forest. But in addition, as he looked in front of him, he saw coming towards him a very beautiful girl, naked, with disordered hair and all scratched by the thorns and twigs of the brambles and bushes in the wood. She was sweeping and calling for mercy. Beside her, he saw 2 very large, fierce mastiffs, savagely pursuing her and frequently snapping cruelly at her. And behind her on a black horse was a dark knight, with grief and anger in his face, with a sword in his hand, who often threatened her with death in dreadful and insulting terms. This aroused astonishment and terror in his soul, and finally compassion for the unfortunate lady, from which was born the desire to set her free from such agony and such a death if he could. But finding himself unarmed, he ran to tear off a tree bow in place of a cudgel and began to advance towards the dogs and the knight. But the knight saw him and called to him from a distance, "Nastagio, don't meddle here. Let me and these dogs do what this wicked woman has deserved." As he spoke, the dogs seized the girl by the thighs, bringing her to the ground, and the knight dismounted from his horse. Nastagio went up to him and said, "I do not know who you are, though you seem to know me. But I tell you, it is baseness in an armed knight to want to kill a naked lady, and to have set dogs at her as if she were a wild beast. I shall certainly defend her as far as I can." Then said the knight, "Nastagio, I'm of the same country as yourself. And you were still a little child when I, whose name was Messer Guido degli Anastagi, was more deeply in love with this woman than you are now with your Traversaro. Owing to her cruelty and pride, my misfortune caused me in despair to kill myself with the sword you see in my hand, and I am damned to eternal punishment. Not long afterwards, she who had rejoiced exceedingly at my death died also, and died unrepentant, believing that she had not sinned but done well. But for the sin of her cruelty and her rejoicing at my torments, she too was and is damned to this punishment of hell. When she descended into hell, the punishment imposed upon us was that she should fly from me, and that I, who once loved her so much, should pursue her as a mortal enemy, not as a beloved woman. As often as I catch her, I kill her with the very sword with which I slew myself, and split her open and drag out, as you will soon see, the hard, cold heart wherein love and pity could never enter, together with her entrails, and give them to these dogs to eat. After no long space of time, in accordance with the justice and the will of God, she rises up again, as if she had not been dead, and once more begins her anguished flight. And I and the dogs pursue her. Every Friday at this hour I catch up with her here, and slaughter her, as you will see. And do not think that we rest on other days. I catch her in other places where she thought or wrought cruelly against me. Having changed from a lover to an enemy, as you see, I am condemned in this way to pursue her for as many years as the months she was cruel to me. Now let me execute divine justice and strive not to oppose what you cannot prevent. Nastasio was terrified by these words, and there was scarcely a hair of his body which did not stand on end. He drew back and gazed at the miserable girl, awaiting fearfully what the knight would do. When the knight had done speaking, he rushed like a mad dog at the girl, with his sword in his hand, while she, held on her knees by the mastiffs, shrieked for mercy. But he thrust his sword with all his strength through the middle of her breast until it stood out behind her back. When the girl received this thrust, she fell forward, still weeping and shrieking. The knight took a dagger in his hand, slit her open, took out her heart and everything near it, and threw them to the mastiffs, who hungrily devoured them at once. But before long, the girl suddenly rose to her feet as if nothing had happened, and began to run towards the sea, with the dogs continually snapping at her. The knight took his sword, remounted his horse, and followed. And in a short time they were so far away that Nastasio lost sight of them. After seeing these things, Nastasio hesitated a long time between pity and fear. But after some time it occurred to him that it might be useful to him, since it happened every Friday. So having marked the place, he returned to his servants, and in due course sent for many of his relatives and friends, to whom he said, "You've long urged me to refrain from loving my fair enemy, and to cease my expense. I am ready to do so, if you will do me one favor, which is that next Friday you will come and dine with me, and bring Mr. Paulo Travesaro, his wife, his daughter, all their women relatives, and any other women you like. Why I want this you will see later." They thought this a small thing to do, so they returned to Ravenna and invited those whom Nastasio wanted. And although it was hard to get the girl whom Nastasio loved, still she went along with the rest. Nastasio made preparations for a magnificent feast, and had the table set among the pines near the place where he had seen the massacre of the cruel lady. He placed the men and women at table in such a manner that the girl he loved was exactly opposite the place where this would happen. The last course had arrived when they all began to hear the despairing shrieks of the pursued lady. Everyone was astonished and asked what it was. Nobody knew. They stood up to look and saw the agonized girl and the dogs in the night. And in a very short time they all arrived in front of them. Great was the uproar against the knight and dogs, and many started forward to help the girl. But the knight, speaking to them as he had spoken to Nastasio, not only made them draw back, but filled them with astonishment and terror. He did what he had done before, and all the women, many of whom were relatives of the suffering girl in the night, and remembered his love and death, wept as wretchedly as if it had been done to themselves. When the massacre was over, the lady and the knight had gone. Those who had seen it fell into different sorts of discourse. But the most frightened was the cruel lady beloved by Nastasio, who had distinctly seen and heard everything, and knew that these things came nearer to her than to anyone else, for she remembered the cruelty with which she had always treated Nastasio. So that in her mind's eye, she already seemed to be flying from his rage and to feel the mastiffs at her sides. Such fear was born in her that from this, to avoid its happening to her, she could scarcely wait for that evening to change her hate into love, and to send a trusted maidservant secretly to Nastasio, begging him to go to see her, because she was ready to do anything he pleased. Nastasio replied that this was a happiness to him, but that he desired his pleasure with honor, which was to take her as his wife, if she would agree. The girl knew that she herself had been the only obstacle to this hitherto, and replied that she was willing. So making herself the messenger, she told her father and mother that she was willing to marry Nastasio, which greatly delighted them. Next Sunday, Anastasio married her and made a wedding feast and lived happily with her for a long time. Nor was this the only good which resulted from this terrifying apparition, for all the ladies of Ravenna took fear and became far more compliant to the pleasures of the men than they had ever been before.
Nice. Suresh, why did you choose that story out of the 100?
What I love about the Decameron is it's a choose your own adventure and find your path through. And for me, this is a kind of a cipher. It's in Ravenna, which is the place where the tomb of Dante is located. And Boccaccio owes a debt to Dante. He admires him greatly. It's the place where Dante died of malarial fever unexpectedly. And it's not the place I think he would have chosen to die. But what I love about this is this retelling really captures the disruption that the plague brings to Europe and to its narrative arcs. This is a reversal of a classic theme. If I think of the death of Actaeon, who is a man who makes the mistake of glimpsing naked Diana and then is turned into a stag and has dogs set upon him, this is the reverse of that. And yet the reason that the Traversaro girl is condemned to this infernal massacre is because she was modest. That is described as cruelty, as disdain initially, and it connects to a lot of the other tales where what the narrators are attempting to do is to tell people that these are different times and different times call for different morals, and maybe we should just be loving as quickly and as openly as we can. So what I love is that connection to the classical world, and specifically this connection to Dante. And I think there's an echo here of the 13th canto of the Inferno, where in the place of the self-murderers, it's the seventh circle, second ring of hell. You have people who've taken their own lives, as Anastasio was considering taking his own life before he began this reverie. In that canto as well, sinners are set upon by dogs, and branches are broken off the trees in very, very allegorical fashion, similar to this tale.
Now, this story is also the subject of a very famous series of paintings by Botticelli.
It is, and as you know, there's also the Titian painting of the death of Actaeon, which is, I believe, on display at the National Gallery in Britain.
Okay, Dr. Capozzo, did you want to follow up?
Yes, I do. I really like the fact you were talking about the reverse of a classical theme that Boccaccio is always doing, because it's very important, I think, to understand and underline that Boccaccio is one of the greatest mediators between the classical world and the Renaissance, okay? And so, like Dante that you just quoted and Petrarch, he was fascinated by the classical past. And, you know, the humanism, so the time between Middle Ages and Renaissance, is characterized by the rediscovery of the ancient world. And so the ancient thoughts, philosophy, narrative, poetic in general, as you perfectly said just before. If you think, in fact, it's important to point out that Boccaccio was one of the first in Italy to celebrate the Greek culture, even before Petrarch, actually, before Petrarch did. And that's another important aspect, I think. And, you know, in my opinion, Boccaccio made a crucial contribution to the Renaissance. He's an important figure in the development of humanism, obviously. And so in the Italian language, and so in the modern literature, as well as for the development of how I can say, a modern conception of the individual. And so the increase of new forms of cultural expressions, always linked, as you said, with the classical one. You said that the different is the time and different should be the moral. And I think this kind of intellectual, Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio, just to quote the most famous, obviously, they all three have the same idea. there is a continuity in time that we can save our morality. And ancient world is teaching that. And probably the Renaissance is what they will save. There is another important aspect I would like briefly to underline is the linguistic one. So along with Dante and Petrarch, Boccaccio worked to make Italian a literary language. So that's the reason for why I chose Elisabetta da Messina, one tale that I would like to read, just a little part of it in Italian, obviously showing you and the audience the English translation. But I think it's important because it's followed up by a dream, as you had a vision in your own novella, while we have a dream in mind. And dreams, as we shall see, are an important factor in the continuity of culture and, in this case, interpretation through times. So let me share my, just a second, sorry, my screen. Yes. Okay. Can you see the PowerPoint? I'm sorry, yes, probably you can.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, now we adapted Boccaccio to the face mask that we should. So we were talking about, I was saying about the first symbolic, let's say, dream in the Decameron, and so the story of Elisabetta da Messina, that dreams about her beloved Lorenzo, who during the dream reveals her his death and the place where his body is hidden. He also tells who killed him and why. And the murders, as you can see from this manuscript image, that is really nice, so we can see the dynamic of the novella, that the murders are actually Elisabetta's own brothers who stood against their love. And after she wakes up from her dream, Elisabetta, we will find Lorenzo's body according to the indication he gave her. So let me start with the text in English and I will read once again in Italian. Avvenne una notte che, avendo costei molto pianto, Lorenzo, che non tornava, essendosi alla fine piangendo addormentata, Lorenzo l'apparve nel sonno, pallido e tutto rabbuffato, e coi panni tutti stracciati e fracidi. E parvele che egli dicesse: «Oh Elisabetta, tu non mi hai fatto altro che chiamare dalla mia lunga dimora t'attristi, e me con le tue lagrime fieramente accusi. E perciò sappi che io non posso più ritornarci. Perciò che l'ultimo dì che tu mi vedesti, i tuoi fratelli m'uccisono». E disegnatole il luogo dove sotterraneo l'avevano, le disse che più non chiamasse né l'aspettasse e disparve. La giovane, destatasi e dando fede alla visione, amaramente pianse. Poi, la mattina levata, non avendo ardire di dire alcuna cosa ai fratelli, propose di voler andare al mostrato luogo e di vedere se ciò fosse vero che nel sonno le era paruto. E avuta la licenza d'andare alquanto fuor della terra di porto, in compagnia d'una che altra volta con loro era stata, e tutti i suoi fatti sapea, quando piuttosto poté, la se n'andò, e tolte via foglie secche, quel luogo erano dove mendura le parve la terra cui vi cavò. Ne ebbe guari cavato, che ella trovò il corpo del suo misero amante in niuna cosa ancora guasto, né corrotto, perché manifestamente conobbe essere stata vera la sua visione. Di che più che altra femmina dolorosa, conoscendo che quivi non era da piagnere, se avesse potuto volentieri tutto il corpo n'avrebbe portato, per dargli più convenevole sepoltura. Ma veggendo che ciò esser non poteva, con un coltello il meglio che poté gli spiccò dall'umbusto la testa e quello in un asciugatoio inviluppata, e la terra sopra l'altro corpo gittata, messala in grembo alla fante, senza essere stata dal conveduta, quindi si dipartì e tornossene a casa sua. Quivi, con questa testa nella sua camera rinchiusasi, sopra a esser lungamente e amaramente pianse, tanto che tutta con le sue lagrime la lavò, 1000 baci dandole in ogni parte. Poi riprese un grande e un bel testo, e di questi nei quali si pianta la persa o il basilico, e dentro la vi mise fasciata in un bel drappo. E poi, messavi in sulla terra, su vi piantò parecchi piedi, di bellissimo basilico salernitano, e quegli da niun'altra acqua che rosata o di fior d'aranci o delle sue lagrime non innaffiava giammai. This kind of dream like all the literary dreams, they have a really old origin, an ancient origin. For example, just to come back to the classical era, like Homer and Virgil, for example, they have dreams in their literature, obviously. And so what does it mean that Boccaccio is linked with the popular culture of a dream interpretation to enhance his own novellas? Because after what we read, obviously I just read a little part of the entire novella, but after a few days, her brothers, however, will discover her attempt and will take the head away from her. And so poor Elisabetta, she starts suffering a lot. And so at the end of the novella, she will die. So dream interpretation, I think, is a very good source to understand the continuity in time. Just to make a fast example, from Egypt to today, and stopping from North Italy in 14th century, the kind of methodology of dream interpretation is still the same, and the symbology and the symbols are still the same. So what Boccaccio is doing is changing, thanks to Dante first, the language is a vernacular language. So a language that everyone can understand. At the same time, he's using symbols. They are easily understandable for everyone to build his own narrative on. So what does it mean that? They're using the most popular dream books of the Middle Ages, called the Somniale Danieli, so better, the dream book of Daniel the prophet. That was a manual to dream and their interpretations, and it was the most popular of its kind during the Middle Ages. According to this dream book, as we can see, the first quotation, col morto favellare significa lite. So to talk with a dead person, as exactly Elisabetta does in the novella, talking with her beloved Lorenzo, signifies quarrel. So which kind of quarrel? Is a dispute that Elisabetta will have the second half of the novella with her own brothers, talking about her love with the poor, let's say, Lorenzo. So as you can see, the continuity from Egypt, from classical and medieval, and then Renaissance, is the popular culture on which narrative or poetry is built on. Let me conclude, in fact, underlining once again that another element that brings Boccaccio back in time and forward to the Renaissance, in a way, as we are doing now. In fact, those kind of dreams from the manuscript tradition became exactly the same in the printed edition at the end of 15th century. It's exactly the same. Who owned these kind of books? That was my question at the beginning of my work. Someone that is kind of important, like Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci used to own 3 editions of the same dream book that Boccaccio was using, and the copyists were copying with the Decameron in the manuscript tradition. And Sigmund Freud knew very well that he wrote the Leonardo da Vinci the memory of his childhood, because Leonardo da Vinci used to interpret his own dreams through the Somniale Danieli. You see how from back in history we are going even beyond the Renaissance, actually. But the question now, really to conclude, is why all that? Why dreams is a link, or one of the many links? Now I'm just offering just one link, obviously. Probably for the same that everyone dreams. We all dream, and we all try to interpret in all time and societies the image, the mysterious image that we get in dreams. And then so probably, because we are trying to answer, as Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio, Leonardo da Vinci try to answer this question: why does the eye sees a thing more clearly in dreams than the imagination awake? And that's probably the reason for why dreams and narratives, they find the same kind of atmosphere in which they could analyze reality better than reality itself. So I think Boccaccio is important in this kind of tradition.
Let me ask you a question. So if I understand you correctly, he is using a dream book that is circulated among other people. Da Vinci has a copy of the dream book. And while the story you told had gruesome elements, it wasn't a nightmare. I say this, the story that you showed us has gruesome elements, but the dream is not a nightmare. And one thing that strikes me in the Decameron is the absence of horror. So he's been through a disaster. A third of the population has died. But in many ways, it seems like the book could have been written before the plague. It seems that the theme of the book is not horror, it's love. It's a book about love, stories about love primarily.
Yes.
And you're nodding as if you agree.
I completely agree, and I like very much your point, because you are right that there is no horror in a way, even if there is some in between the lines, since human beings is not really a good one. So there is some horror, you know. But at the same time, actually, in the introduction to the Decameron, Boccaccio says, to survive the plague, to survive the nature, the reaction of the nature against human beings, literature is the only thing, because telling stories between friends can be really the only way to survive and to find pleasure. And pleasure is a key word in the Decameron, to understand better our world, to understand better which kind of person we are. And so I think literature is considered as a pleasure, and the pleasure is considered pedagogically as something that we can, from which we can learn how to live better and be better. So horror is in the stories, is in the behavior of people. Like in the novella you are going to read, for example, there are a lot of misunderstanding, there's a lot of bad behavior in this way. And love means the consolation of the of life, you know, of all the trouble we can suffer in life. Consolation is sharing. Once we can share stories and so experiences, literature will help us in surviving much better. So it's a different level of horror inside the stories.
Thank you. We had a question from John Paponis in the audience. I'm not sure if John is still with us. John, are you still there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for putting this on. I've greatly enjoyed it. First of all, I have to comment, this has nothing to do with it, but I have to comment on the Blondie poster in the background there. And if there's anything that feeling going through a plague will tell you, is that maybe we all sort of have hearts of glass. But I just wanted to say that one of the things that I definitely picked up in hearing the story, and one of the feelings that I got from it, was that it was essentially, to me, it felt very much like a story of action. It was a story about taking action, trying to control things around you that are, you know, maybe disturbing to you or upsetting to you, but fundamentally reacting to those things, trying to take action to change the situation around you. And again and again, even the story that was mentioned of, you know, even you hear that someone has died, and you must physically get up and go and like touch that dead body. There is something that you can't just. There's sort of the inevitability of death, and something that you can't, that we all have to deal with one way or another, but you have to go and physically touch it. And like, if anybody's been to a funeral in which, you know, you a close family member, some people, you know, physically touch a body at a funeral as almost a human way of, you know, reassuring yourself that this is in fact real. And I just wanted to ask you guys if you could comment maybe a little bit more on that theme of control in sort of situations where it feels like you don't have a lot of control, which would also be an experience that, you know, living through a plague can definitely give you, as we can all sort of feel from experience.
If I could jump in, there's a tale on the 9th day, the 7th tale. Talano has a dream, if I could follow up with the dream, that his wife should not go out into the woods the next day because she'll be attacked by a wolf. And the dream is very vivid. He imagines the wolf grabbing her at the neck. And the reason I think this matches your question is it's a real question of sheltering in place is also an action, right? The idea that we are choosing to restrain ourselves. She decides that he must be dreaming ill because he intends ill. She goes out, and what is attacked is her neck, in the same way that the plague was attacking lymph nodes at the armpit, the neck, the groin area. So what's peeking through the tail are all of the attempts of the people who are finding themselves in new situations to rethink what sphere of action they have, and then what responsibility should accompany those actions.
Okay, thank you. What do you guys make of the social critique in the book? So, for example, churchmen are satirized again and again in the book. Monks, nuns, the Pope, right? This put me in mind of Erasmus's Praise of Folly, which will be written later, more than a century later. Do you think that these elements are remarkable in the book?
I'd like to just build on something that Dr. Capozzo said, which was that what Boccaccio is reading is the classical world. And that idea of a trenchant, satirical voice, that's Ovid coming through in Boccaccio, as far as I can tell. It's the metamorphoses coming up, it's the amores, it's the ars amatoria, and all of that is political, if I could use a word that's maybe one step ahead of a social critique. I think that there is a literary voice that has a right to pass judgment on society and what it does.
Okay, we have a text question from Raymond Fernandez. Mr. Fernandez writes, "It is interesting that love is the prescription for the horror that is going on around them as the plague progresses. Can this be interpreted as a message to us, who during this particular plague need to control our responses to the horror around us?" Now, Dr. Capozzo has said that one retains control through stories, through the intellectual life. Mr. Fernandez is saying that one can also maintain control through love. I remember that in the introduction, at the very beginning, Boccaccio says that he can empathize with those around him because he has suffered in love, which seemed almost like a joke. Really? Really? You think that your broken heart compares to the death of one's family members? But he means it. He's serious. Did you notice that, Serge?
In the tale that Dr. Capozzo read of Lisabetta and Lorenzo, that's a really intimate tale, but it's also, I think, on a larger scale, it's also how should we as a society be thinking through our sense of grief and our sense of mourning. The head that she recovers is because she can't get the whole body. And we are living in a situation where we have a number of families that are unable to grieve or mourn physically with those that have passed. But she severs the head and she finds a pot and she places earth onto it and grows basil, and she only waters it with her tears and with rose water or orange peel water. That again is, I think, both the confluence of the intimate, something that she wants to do for her dead lover, but also the rose water is what was thought to be a cure in the Middle Ages for the plague. There were monks who were trafficking in this stuff as if it was the antidote. And so I think those two spheres do come together. And where you said, really, can he compare his losses to the losses at a societal level? I think there's a way in which they speak to each other.
Yeah, may I?
Of course.
That's very interesting what you said. There is something in Italian that I think we should point out, that the flower pot in Italian is vaso or can be testo, but testo means text as well. So I think it's always a literary question for Boccaccio. I mean, putting the head of her lover in a text or in a pot, you see what I mean? The ambiguity is very poetic here. And so in order to keep forever your love, your beloved, you should translate them, let's say, into literature, into a text, or in the fiction, into a pot. And so just that how they can bloom, the basil in that case, or the meaning in a text. So I think it's always a double line between literature and superstition, legends, life, you know, and obviously the plague at the time.
Another question has come in, and it mentions, because it mentions Action, I think this is directed at you, Serge. This is from Chris Pacici. Chris says, since day 5, story 8, is the reverse of the Greek myth of Action, do you think the story of day 4, story 5, recalls the opposite of the biblical Judith and Holofernes story? The decapitated head, the maidservant. Lisabetta becomes a kind of widow with the death of her beloved. Obviously, the story is more about love and less about duty, but there is nonetheless a strong connection. Do you agree?
I do. I think that's very insightful. I'm very interested also in the way that it also helps us to continue to stitch that theme of the political. Judith's decapitation of Holofernes is a political act. The beheading for me immediately suggested John the Baptist. So if you were asking which head I was thinking of, it was that one. And again, reversal, right? If Salome is asking for the head, but she doesn't really want it, here you have Lisabetta really wants the head. And that, I think, is also an interesting role reversal.
Yeah, it's also very interesting that a woman, in this case, can cut the head without committing a murder at the same time, you know? So everything is changing. All the levels of the normality, let's say, is changing. So a woman now is allowed to do so, not for a bad reason, but for a good reason, a lovely reason in a way, you know. So that's another thing that I think should be pointed out, and think about how Boccaccio thinks about women and how women, so in the Decameron, and not just in the Decameron, are acting, how brave, how determined they are.
Okay. John Paponis has a second question. This was the age of the miasma, the bad air theory of disease. Are there any traces of the dominant beliefs about disease in these stories? Anyone?
I'm sorry.
In other words, John is asking. John is asking.
Sorry.
John is asking whether or not in these stories you find the theories of disease of Boccaccio's day.
I believe Dr. Capozzo already hit on this question of like what the best cure is, and that is not to talk about the terrible things, to love and to heal in community, and that the storytelling is actually part of the prescription. So if there were a doctor at the time who was like, what should you do? Whatever you do, get away, get far away from the city where contagion is rampant. And if you must turn your all of your humors and all of your soul to a place, make it a more beautiful place. A locus amenus is the Latin theory for this, a sort of a garden and a paradise. That's where you should try and place yourself.
It's great what you said, because especially using the vernacular Italian, what Boccaccio is doing is to spread out the medicine. Let's say to everyone. It's not just keeping for an intellectual elite, but now literature can be for everyone. And that's really important if, as I believe, and as you said, literature can be the cure of the moment.
So I had thought that I would take a turn reading a story, but I worry that my internet connection is unstable. Have I been cut off several times? Do you think I can make it through a story?
I think so, yeah.
I think so.
Okay. Boccaccio later in life met Chaucer, of course. Chaucer was sent on a mission into Florence by the King of England. He met Boccaccio. The exact nature of the mission is not known. But the story I would like to read, I think, sounds so much like one of the stories from Canterbury Tales. This is the third day, the 10th story. Gracious ladies, perhaps you have never heard how the devil can be put back into hell. And so, without diverging in the least from the topic which all of you have talked about today, I shall tell possible. Perhaps when you learn how to do you may still be in time to save your souls. And you will also learn that love is more at home in delightful palaces and luxurious bedrooms than in poor huts. He nevertheless makes himself felt in dense woodlands, on rugged mountains, and in desert caves. It is not difficult to understand the reason for this, for, after all, there is nothing that is not subject to his power. Getting to the point, then, that there once lived in the town of Capsa in Tunisia a very wealthy man who had, in addition to several sons, a beautiful and charming daughter whose name was Alibek. She was not a Christian, but because she heard so many Christians in her town praising their faith in the service of God, one day she asked one of those Christians how she could best and most quickly serve God. This person answered that those best served God who denied the things of this world, following the example of those who had gone to live in the Egyptian desert. The young girl was rather naive, for she was no more than 14 years old. Moved by childish impulse rather than deliberate decision, she set out for the Egyptian desert all alone, without a word to anyone the next morning. Spurred on by her desire and with great difficulty, she reached saw a small hut to which she went, and there she found a holy man on the threshold. Amazed to see her, the man asked her what she was doing there. The girl replied that she was inspired by God and that she wanted to enter his service, but that she had not yet met anyone who might teach her how to serve God. Seeing how young and beautiful she was, and fearing how the devil might tempt him if he kept her bed near him, the good man praised her fine intentions, and after having given her a quantity of grass roots, wild apples and dates to eat, and some water to drink, he said to her, "My child, not so far from here there lives a holy man who is far more qualified than I to teach you what you wish to learn, and you should go to him." And he showed her the way. And when she arrived, she heard the same words from this other man. And so she went further on until finally she came to the cell of a young hermit, a very devout and good person whose name was Rustico, and of whom she asked the same questions she had asked the previous two. Since Rustico was anxious to test his willpower, he did not send her away or tell her to search for someone else. On the contrary, he kept her with him in his cell. And when night came, he made a bed of palm leaves in one corner of the cell, and he asked her to sleep there. No sooner had he made the bed than temptation began to struggle with his willpower, and discovering that he had greatly overestimated his ability to resist, he shrugged his shoulders and surrendered without a battle. Setting aside his holy thoughts, his prayers, and his flagellations, he began contemplating the youth and the beauty of the girl, and also how he ought to act with her, so that she would not become aware of his licentiousness as he went about getting what he wanted from her. After testing her out with some questions, he discovered that she had actually never slept with a man before, and that she was really just as naive as she appeared. And so he decided that she, under the pretext of serving God, might well be the one to satisfy his desires. He began with great eloquence to show her how much of an enemy the devil was to God, and then he gave her to understand that no service could be more pleasing to God than to put the devil back into his hell, the place to which God had damned him. The young girl asked him how this might be accomplished, to which Rustico replied, "You will soon find out, but first you must do whatever you see me do." And he began to remove those few garments he possessed until he was stark naked. And the girl did the same. She then sank to her knees as if he then sank to his knees as if he wished to pray, and he made her kneel opposite him in the same fashion. Being in this position, and more than ever burning with desire from the sight of her kneeling there so beautiful, the flesh was resurrected. Alibek looked at it in amazement and said, "Rustico, what is that thing I see sticking out in front of you?" "And which I do not have. Now you can see him for yourself. He is inflicting such pain on me that I could hardly bear it." "Praise be to God," said the girl. "I am better off than you are, for I do not have such a devil." That is very true, Rustico replied, but you do have something else which I do not have, and you have it in place of this. Oh, answered Alabec, what is it? You have a hell, said Rustico, and I firmly believe that God has sent you here for the salvation of my soul. Since this devil gives me so much pain, you could be the one to take pity on me by allowing me to put him back into hell. You would be giving me great comfort, and you will render a great service to God by making him happy, which is what you say your purpose in coming here was. Oh, Father, replied the girl in good faith, since I have hell, let us do as you wish and as soon as possible. May God bless you, my child. He will at last leave me in peace. And having said this, he led the girl over to him and showed her what position to take in order to incarcerate that cursed devil. The young
Oops.
And to prove that it would not be, he put him back in hell 7 times before getting out of bed. In fact, after the 7th time, the devil found it impossible to rear his arrogant head, and he was content to be at peace now. But the devil's pride was to rise up many a time, and the young girl, who was always obedient and eager to take him in, began to grow fond of this sport. She said to Rustico, now I certainly understand what those good men of Capsa meant when they said that serving God was so pleasurable. And I cannot really remember anything I've ever done which was more pleasing or satisfying than putting the devil back into hell. I even think that anyone who thinks of anything but serving God is a fool. And for this reason, she would often come to Rustico saying, Father, I have come here to serve God and not to waste any time. Let's go and put the devil back into hell. Okay, I'm going to stop without finishing this because I don't want to take unnecessary time away from the conversation and from any of your questions. But it interests me that the bawdiness of the story. Someone who told me, I think, Serge, you told me that someone has said that Boccaccio is obscene without being offensive, right?
It was a reviewer. It was a reviewer of the Pasolini film. Vincent Canby of the New York Times described the movie as obscene but not offensive.
Oh, okay. Right. And that's the occasion. I want to bring in also a quotation from Petrarch having to do with love. This comes from Petrarch's work, My Secret Book. And he says here that love can be regarded, depending on its object, as the basest passion of all or the noblest of man's activities. And I think this story, this playful body story, it's humorous. It's a humorous story about low things, but it's not base. It's not base. This is, I would say, humor as defiance. Humor as defiance of horror, the horror of the plague. And it's a refusal to turn toward self-flagellation and a refusal to become disenchanted or disillusioned with the sensual life. You see, that's one thing that amazes me in Boccaccio, that in the opening pages, he gives a plague description that is so much like the plague description in Thucydides or in Pepys's description of plague in London. He talks about the horror, but when they escape the city, they escape the horror, and their love of life, the pleasure of life, is intact.
I agree. I think that the tale you chose is a 10th tale, and in each set, the last tale is told by Dioneo. He's the Dionysian lustful voice. He's one of the 3 men, and his goal is always to make the young women blush. And so just to build on what you said, even if they're not able to touch physically, that would definitely be a perversion of courtly love for these 7 and 3. Through the text, they appear to be crossing lines, and there's a transgressive element to that narrative.
Yeah, I agree with that. And to be honest, looks like that everything is kind of upside down. So there is the plague, and the Brigata can find a nice place to be, a locus amenus, as you said, a villa right out Florence. You know, a Christian is trying to trick a Muslim, as the novella you're saying, but actually is the Christian that is the bad guy and not the Muslim. You know, women that are obscene, and so going around the city telling the story and laughing over that. So, or Elisabetta da Messina, as we just said before, cutting the head of a man, so quoting classical biblical literature, but putting in the contemporaneity of Boccaccio and announcing so the freedom, let's say, of the Renaissance at the same time. So everything is kind of upside down, but thanks to the fact that it's upside down, things are clearer than in the normal and social and everyday reality. And probably that's the reason for why his narrative looks and is so realistic at the same time, and not obscene or horror or whatever adjective we can apply straightforward.
If I may, let me talk for a minute. Let me step just for a minute away from the book and talk about the historical context. What I'm going to say, I'm going to rely in large part on this book by David Herlihy, this book, which is The Black Death and the Transformation of the West. All right. I won't go on at great length about this, but Herlihy makes a number of interesting points about the bubonic plague in Europe. He says that he talks about the idea of a Malthusian cycle. He talks about you're all familiar with the Malthusian cycle. Malthus's idea that human populations will grow until they equal the available food supply, and inevitably there will be a crash. Herlihy says that in medieval Europe, there wasn't a Malthusian cycle, there was a stalemate. He says that populations had been very large and very stable for quite some time. And this resulted in low wages, chronic malnourishment, and little technological innovation. He says that the European economy was saturated. All available resources were committed to food production, right? Herlihy says the plague actually freed up resources. That, for example, land that had been cultivated was available for pasturage. Now, instead of growing wheat, it was available for sheep. And the keeping of sheep is not labor intensive. 1 or 2 shepherds can watch hundreds of animals, right? So it's easier to extract value from the land than it was under the cultivation of wheat. He says that with the high death rate in the plague, labor became more valuable. Laborers could charge more for their labor. With fewer hands, with fewer people available, there was a new stimulus to technological innovation. He traces the plague to the development of the printing press and Gutenberg. So Herlihy sees the bubonic plague as actually breaking Europe out of a kind of stagnation and leading to something better later on. I suppose this thesis is controversial. It was published in 1997. I'm sure it's been challenged in the 20 years since. Any comment?
Probably historically speaking, at that time, looks like a contradiction, that's for sure, but the time in which the plague took place, so around 1348, the corruption of the church, the situation of the agriculture, the situation of the commune, and so the economical crisis, and all that was pushing the society to reach a breaking point, actually. So probably the plague, according to the author you were quoting, was the beginning of a renovation of many things. Probably, in my opinion, I think now is exactly the opposite, because we reach a point in which technology was overcoming everything. So probably we should come back a little bit to normal real life, let's call it, instead of following the desire of achievement just about technology once again. But in 1348, the situation was really tough, economically speaking, obviously, and politically speaking, and religious, so the morality. And so probably was kind of a renovation, as Boccaccio was wishing. And that's the reason for why his characters are safe, or at least the main narrators.
All right. Anything else, guys? Any questions from the audience?
I'd be interested in talking about the Pasolini adaptation of the Decameron.
Sure.
It's also a controversial film. It's part of the trilogy of life cycle. So Pasolini, the Italian director, ends up taking a look at three medieval tales: the Decameron, the Canterbury Tales, which you've referenced, and also the Arabian Nights, the 1001 Nights. And I think that the tale you read, where we have the Muslim and the Christian world coming together, is part of that epical religious viewpoint that Pasolini adopts. And the tale that Dr. Capozzo read in particular stands out in my mind for the mise en scène that he's got going on. The three brothers actually hunt down Lorenzo. They bring him out. There's a sort of a ruse where they're like, let's go eat. And then the camera is just shifting back and forth with flashback when he realizes something's wrong, all the way through the kill. And what I love about what film can do that text can only hope to inspire, I think, is begin to give us images to go with these words. And so that's one of the things that I think would add to some of our audience members' appreciation of the book, is taking a look at the 10 tales that Pasolini chooses to stitch together in his early 1970s movie.
That's a great point, and thank you very much for Pasolini. I'm wondering what Pasolini or better, Boccaccio and Pasolini, they have in common. So it's the realistic depiction of reality. So Pasolini comes right after the neorealism. There is a language or a codex or a kind of cinematography in which the reality has to be registered without an artistic filter, let's say. Pasolini obviously does, but not much. So I'm thinking about Andreuccio da Perugia, no? One of the
yes.
For example, because of the market. Market was obviously the most important place in the medieval cities, intending with social, not distance, but the contrary of social distance. And as you can see, the people how they act is reproducing sort of reality of the Middle Ages, even if in 1971. But is a big eye and a deep eye on what the reality used to be and is or was in 1971. So Boccaccio and Pasolini, they have something in common in the representation of the good, the bad, doesn't matter what, without judging. And that's the reason for why it's not obscene, because there is no judgment behind by the two authors. And another thing that Pasolini chose, the Arabian Nights and Chaucer, I think he got the red thread of the novelists of our world, Eastern and Western world, together.
I agree.
Okay. You've heard the question asked before. If you were stranded for the rest of your life on a remote island and you could take only one book with you, which one would you choose? I think the Decameron would be a great choice. It's inexhaustibly interesting. You would be taking 10 friends with you, the 10 people who tell stories. I have a question from Pat Cornett. Could you give us the information about the film, its director, etc.?
Pasolini is a controversial author, cinematographer. Many people, since we just came out of the Easter season, may be familiar with the 1964, I think it is, Gospel according to St. Matthew, and that would be a lot of people in the West's understanding of the movie. Rabbia, Acatone. There are a number of films by Pasolini that make him a celebrity. Really in the European scene. He's a Marxist. He runs afoul of the church. He's excommunicated. He dies a violent death in 1975. He's always a poet, is what I would say. And one of the things that stand out for me is his manifesto for a new theater, where he really calls for a rediscovery of Greek theater and what Greek theater did for audiences. And so I would say that's what I appreciate about his vision, about his way of looking at the world. And the three films together form a trilogy called the Trilogy of Life, which is available through Criterion and probably some other streaming mediums as well.
And Chris Pacici has once again sent a text question. Mr. Pacici, your questions are so interesting. Are you sure you wouldn't like to audibly ask it yourself and join the conversation? Okay, well then I will read it for him. Here is the question. Could you comment on the film Wondrous Boccaccio by the Taviani brothers? How do you compare it to Pasolini's interpretation of Boccaccio?
Nice question.
I'm going to defer that one. I have not seen the second film, so I'm going to defer that question.
Okay, I think the Taviani brothers movie, Meraviglioso Boccaccio, first of all, in the title, you can see that it's following or is narrative more than the point of view of the characters and so the society itself. If, as I said before, Pasolini's Decameron is kind of neorealistic, please, let's understand what I'm saying, but just checking and depicting the reality with no much filters in this way. Meraviglioso Boccaccio is completely different. It's more poetic. It's more inside the tale, for example. So this is the difference. So in a way, let's say that Taviani brothers' movie is more faithful to the fiction of the narrative, while Pasolini probably is closer to its author, so Boccaccio himself. That's my vision between the things. But surely it's worth it to watch both. So.
Okay. Valerio, Serge, do either of you have, there's another question, Corinne Stavish. Dr. Vogt referenced the Black Plague book, which pointed out the positive outcomes of the Black Plague. Boccaccio's theme in the Decameron is primarily love. Combining these ideas, might one of the positive results of the current plague be that we might reduce hostility in our society? Guys, any thoughts?
You know, I think in the Decameron, the way to react to the plague is to, and I'm following obviously the introduction to the Decameron itself, is to have order, to make an order in between the comfortation of things and love and pleasure of things, and even the suffering, obviously, from the situation. But order is something that lets you organize everything in your life, even suffering or having pleasure at the same time. I don't think in our world order can be a word worthy of its own meaning. I'm talking about worldwide. I'm talking about Italy, Europe, United States, and so on. So without order and so organization and so brave to make moves, I'm not really sure if we can get something good from it. So we have to reestablish something before getting the difficult gift of a difficult situation.
I think to build on that, the text is a gift, that where we may choose to try and put the accent on the tragic. There's something about the text being elegiac that is sorrowful, and it is also one that inspires a kind of a lament, but it quietly glorifies the vernacular and the quotidian and the intimate. And for those reasons, I think that it is, just to say it one more time, it's a healing text. And maybe we can be inspired by that.
Well, then let me ask you both. When you say it's healing, you imply it's stabilizing, that it restores stability to a disordered world. And Valeria, you speak of the importance of order, but it's a subversive book. Isn't it a very subversive book? And by through subversion, isn't it undermining, for example, the order of the church?
So if I could just use Pasolini's words on this, when he put together the Gospel according to St. Matthew, the chapter and verse that really stuck out for him was that Jesus had come not to bring order, but to really turn things over. And for him, that is the good news. The good news is that disruption is actually necessary. There's a long Judeo-Christian tradition of going into the vineyard in order to turn the soil so that you can make the vineyard grow again. And so I do believe that both are there. There's a beautiful tension in that destructive, creative process that the book captures.
Yeah, and then if I may add, I didn't specify which kind of order. Even to be bad, you had to be ordered. That's the problem. You know what I mean? It's not a good, necessarily good. Can be bad, can be whatever. The important thing is to be structured. Even to be really bad, you have to be structured. That's what I is trying to say, because there is a structure we have to believe in. There is obviously the Christian one, according to medieval poets or writers, like Dante, for example. But the ordine, so the order, the cosmic order that we have around, we have to, how can I say, we have to look similar to that, even if we can be bad. But without order, there is the entropy, and that's the big problem.
Let me ask you, let me draw a distinction then between chaos and tension. I've heard it said before that when people were struggling to develop flying machines, whenever they attempted to create something that was stable in the air, it was doomed. It would not fly. A successful airplane is unstable, and at every instant it is crashing. You see, it's dynamic, right? And so it seems to me that maybe what Boccaccio is saying is that the stultifying, suffocating orders in life are harmful and bad, especially if they deny human nature. What's useful is a frank acceptance of human nature, especially if we emphasize the importance of love. If I could jump ahead 100 years from Boccaccio to Pico della Mirandola and his oration on the famous oration on the dignity of man, if I could read just a portion of this, right? This is very famous. God the Father, the mightiest architect, had already raised, according to the precepts of his hidden wisdom, this world we see, the cosmic dwelling of divinity, a temple most august. He had already adorned the supercelestial region with intelligences, infused the heavenly globes with the life of immortal souls, and set the fermenting dung heap of the inferior world teeming with every form of animal life. But when this work was done, the divine artificer still longed for some creature which might comprehend the meaning of so vast an achievement, which might be moved with love at its beauty and smitten with awe at its grandeur. When, consequently, all else had been completed, in the very last place, he bethought himself of bringing forth man. Truth was, however, that there remained no archetype according to which he might fashion a new offspring, nor in his treasure house the wherewithal to endow a new son with a fitting inheritance, nor any place among the seats of the universe where the new creature might dispose himself to contemplate the world. All space was already filled. All things had been distributed in the highest, the middle, and the lowest orders. Still, it was not in the nature of the power of the Father to fail in this last creative elan, nor was it in the nature of that supreme wisdom to hesitate through lack of counsel in so crucial a matter, nor finally in the nature of his beneficent love to compel the creature destined to praise the divine generosity and all other things to find it wanting in himself. At last, the supreme creature, to whom he could give nothing wholly his own, should have a share in the particular endowment of every other creature. Taking man, therefore, this creature of indeterminate image, he set him in the middle of the world, and thus spoke to him, "We have given you, O Adam, no visage proper to yourself, nor any endowment proper to your own, in order that whatever place, whatever form, whatever gifts you may with premeditation select, these same you may have and possess through your own judgment and decision. The nature of all other creatures is defined and restricted within laws which we have laid down. You, by contrast, impeded by no such restrictions, made by your own free will to lineaments of your own nature. I have placed you at the very center of the world so that from that vantage point, you may with greater ease glance around you on all that the world contains. We have made you a creature neither of heaven nor of earth, neither mortal nor immortal, in order that you may, as the free and proud shape of your own being, fashion yourself in the power you may prefer." And then immediately afterwards, he calls man this our chameleon, meaning that in the hierarchy of being, right, highest to lowest, only man is not assigned a place, right? Now, we often see a description of man's downward descent as being a debasement. But in Boccaccio, you also see how one can descend in order to enjoy carnal sensual pleasures without being debased. That this is part of what it is to be human, right? And so I really admire his reclaiming of this part of human nature. We are bodily creatures. We are sensual creatures. Okay. If any of you have anything else,
could I just add? I just wanted to add what you just said. It reminds me that the Decameron is sometimes thought a parody of the Hexameron by St. Ambrose, yes. Which was the 6-day creation story of God at work. And so that real act of creation, I'm almost imagining sort of the Sistine Chapel moment of that touching, that immanence and transcendence. That's, I think, what you just read reminds me of in what ties this together. But I'll hand it over.
Okay, well, no other questions in the queue. Any closing remarks? Serge, Valerio?
I was just saying, I think the idea of free will, and so the responsibility that we have and the great gift we have to decide for the best or the bad, in our life, to understand much better than that, probably reading Dante before even reading Boccaccio will be very useful to understand where Boccaccio comes from. Because Boccaccio was the editor, was the publisher, let's say, so was transcribing Dante. Thanks to Boccaccio, we have what we have about Dante since everything was destroyed. So there is a continuity even there that is very important to understand how Boccaccio became Boccaccio, having the Divine Comedy behind.
I love that. I love that blending, that complementing of the two, the Divine Comedy and the human comedy of the Decameron.
That's the point. Thank you.
Okay, for the audience, thank you very much. On the remote chance that Sam Rosenberg is watching, Sam Rosenberg is Emeritus Professor of Romance Languages at Indiana University, where Dr. Capozzo earned his doctorate. Sam Rosenberg is an amazingly accomplished man and also one of the world's finest gentlemen. On the chance he's watching, I'd just like to say, hi, Sam. Okay, I hope everyone in the audience will tune in next week for the discussion of the plague in London in 1665. We're reading Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year and Samuel Pepys' diary. Okay, thank you very much. And Serge and Valero, thank you especially.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you. It was great.
It was wonderful.